Welcome back to the deep dive. So today we're really jumping into something pretty fundamental. We're tracing the journey of an idea, the doctrine of signatures.
Right, an idea that was absolutely central for, well, centuries, really.
Exactly. It wasn't just a quirky belief. It was this whole intricate worldview, wasn't it? This idea that the universe itself leaves clues.
Yeah, divine signatures etched into plants, into nature, showing us their purpose, a speaking cosmos in a way.
And our sources, they really show how deeply this permeated everything, especially medicine, and how people understood the natural world.
But that golden age, as you might call it, where everyone just accepted it, that started to change. It wasn't sudden, though.
No, that's the fascinating part we want to explore today. How did this guiding principle, this core belief, end up being seen as, a quaint superstition?
It's a story of gradual erosion, like you said, not a collapse, but a slow turning of the tide.
Okay, so what was this tide? What started pushing back against this centuries-old doctrine?
Well, it was really the rise of a whole new way of knowing things, a new epistemology, as the academics might say.
A new way of knowing. Sounds fundamental.
It was, and ironically, the very successes of this new approach started to kind of sweep away the old ways, like a current clearing debris.
So the doctrine was about reading meanings, symbols. What did this new approach bring? What were its tools?
Precision, that's the key word. Think, really precise observation, meticulous dissections, literally looking inside.
Opening things up.
Exactly. And then the microscope suddenly revealing worlds no one had seen before, plus the rigor of chemistry, breaking things down into components.
Wow, okay, so less about interpretation and more about measurement, data.
Precisely. It was about tangible, measurable stuff. And this created a real conflict, didn't it?
How so?
Well, you had the doctrine's grand, unified vision, everything connected symbolically. And then this new force comes along, demanding isolating scrutiny, pulling things apart to see how they worked individually.
Right. One sees connections everywhere, the other zooms in on the specific parts.
And that grand vision, it just couldn't really hold up under that kind of intense, focused examination. The philosophies were almost incompatible.
And this wasn't just scholars quietly disagreeing in universities, was it? People started actively challenging the doctrine.
Oh, absolutely. Early scientific thinkers, feeling pretty confident with their new methods, started pointing out the flaws. It became an explicit critique.
What were the main criticisms? What didn't hold up?
Logical inconsistencies, for one. This plant looks like a lung, therefore it treats lung disease. But then, does it actually work?
Ah, the lack of verifiable results.
Exactly. Where's the proof? The intellectual leap from form to function, just based on looks, seemed increasingly shaky without any empirical evidence. It demanded a kind of faith the new methods didn't require.
And you see this playing out in specific fields, right? Like botany.
Definitely. Later botanists, they started classifying plants based on objective features, structure, reproductive parts, things like Linnaeus did, not based on what they looked like they might cure.
It became about taxonomy, not symbolism.
Right. And in medicine, too. That kidney bean example is perfect. Okay, it looks like a kidney, fine. But does it do anything for the kidneys when you actually test it pharmacologically?
Does it have the right chemistry, basically?
Yeah. Its effect needed proof, not just a resemblance. That visual analogy just wasn't cutting it anymore. Makes you wonder how many assumptions were overturned.
Was everyone outside the tradition attacking it? Or was there doubt from within, too?
That's a good point. Even within what you might call the broader natural magic world, some people were starting to say, hang on, maybe relying just on these superficial shapes isn't enough. There was some internal skepticism growing.
So for the new rational empiricists, the bottom line was?
It was just too imprecise, too speculative, too unreliable compared to what you could actually demonstrate, test, and repeat. That became the new gold standard.
Okay, so the ideas were changing. But you mentioned something else changing too, the structure of medicine itself. Medical professionalization.
Yeah, this is huge. While the ideas were shifting, the people doing the healing were changing too. The whole system was being overhauled.
So who was fading out?
Well, think about the traditional figures, the local herbalist, the village wise woman, even the alchemist trying their hand at physician work. Their authority started to decline.
And who was replacing them?
Physicians trained in universities. There was this growing push for formal, academic medical training, standardized training.
And what were they learning that was so different? Not just the doctrine of signatures, presumably.
Oh, completely different. They were learning anatomy from dissection, not just books. physiology, how the body actually functions, and the beginnings of pathology, understanding diseases scientifically.
So doctors were actually cutting open bodies, watching patients systematically.
Yes, and even doing early forms of clinical trials eventually.
Yeah.
The focus shifted totally. It wasn't about cosmic balance or signatures anymore. It was about specific, measurable changes inside the body, what's actually happening at a physical level.
And you mentioned pharmacopoeias earlier, these official drug lists.
Right, that was another big step. Official lists of medicines with standardized ways to prepare them, standardized doses. This really pushed out remedies based purely on analogy or a hunch.
Because the listed drugs had to have shown some actual observable effect.
Exactly. You needed evidence. It worked consistently. No more, it looks like a liver, so try it for jaundice. It had to be demonstrable.
And this new class of trained doctors, they probably wanted to distance themselves from the older ways, right?
Absolutely. Dismissing things like the doctrine of signatures became a way to mark themselves as different, as learned, as scientific, as professional. It helped solidify their authority against the traditional, quote-unquote, unlearned practitioners.
So all these changes, the new scientific method, the professionalization of medicine, they seem to fit into that even bigger picture, the Enlightenment.
Perfectly. The Enlightenment was this massive intellectual wave championing reason, evidence, logic, clear categories above everything else.
The whole goal was kind of tidying up the world with reason.
You could put it that way. Illuminating things, getting rid of superstition, dogma, anything seen as irrational or mystical. Dispelling the shadows, so to speak.
And the pillars of the doctrine, intuition, symbolism, inherited wisdom, how did they fare in that light?
Not well. From the Enlightenment perspective, those things were seen as unreliable, leading to mistakes, to ignorance. If you couldn't demonstrate it logically or empirically, it was suspect.
It had to be provable by anyone using reason.
Precisely. The focus shifted to universal laws, things anyone could verify through observation and reason. And in that climate, the doctrine of signatures, based on these hidden sympathies and divine signs, well, it looked like a relic.
An intellectual anachronism, as you put it.
Exactly. It seemed like the very definition of pre-scientific thinking. Its whole foundation felt completely at odds with the rational spirit of the age.
So it wasn't just left behind, it was actively pushed aside, this legacy of discredit.
Yeah, it wasn't just forgotten. Later, scientific and medical writers often actively caricatured it, dismissed it, held it up as an example of how not to think.
Like a cautionary tale.
Very much so. A symbol of bad science, showing how easily you could be fooled by appearances or wishful thinking if you weren't critical enough.
So in textbooks, it went from being a central idea to, what? A footnote.
Often, yeah. If mentioned at all, it was usually just to show how naive people used to be. An example of superstition that science had thankfully overcome.
And that systematic discrediting really cemented its place outside the mainstream, didn't it?
It did. It almost became defined by what modern science wasn't. It served as a contrast, highlighting the supposed rigor and rationality of the new methods. It was a useful foil, in a way.
But did that narrative miss anything by focusing only on its flaws?
I think so. What often got lost was its incredibly rich philosophical background, its deep cultural roots, and the fact that, in its own way, it did encourage close observation of nature, even if the interpretation was different. Those nuances kind of got swept away in the rush to be modern and rational.
So this vibrant, complex system ended up being packed away, seen as just this quaint, maybe slightly embarrassing relic from the past?
Yeah, a curiosity from a bygone era rather than a once powerful way of understanding the cosmos.
It really makes you think, though. As you said,
To bury a belief under the weight of scorn is easy. To truly understand its nature and the deep reasons it once thrived requires a deeper excavation.
that's a really powerful thought to end on. It prompts you, the listener, to consider this pattern. How easily powerful new ways of thinking can push older ones to the absolute margins, sometimes almost erasing them from memory. What does this story tell you about how we decide what counts as knowledge, what counts as truth, and maybe what gets lost when we dismiss older ideas entirely, even the ones that, lack scientific backing today? Something to ponder.